It's concerning not necessarily from a legal standpoint, but it's concerning from a policy standpoint. What's the statement that's being made there? We need to remember that in those nations where there is oppression, and legitimate oppression, where people are being physically oppressed for their views, often they're doing it, they're making their stance on a moral and religious basis. So they are opposing the Chinese communist regime or the North Korean regime on a moral and religious basis. So if the message that we're sending from corporate America is that it's okay to censor some of those things that we don't find to be popular, that's very concerning. So I think that leads into my second point, which is that this censorship that we've seen, and I'm not saying that this is government censorship, of course, I think this is private censorship, but this private censorship is also, I think, evidence of a concerning mindset in general among some of the internet providers about the rights, human rights, and about the rights of religious persons in particular. I think most of you are familiar with the fact that Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo were famously, or I should say infamously, engaging in censorship and other types of human rights violations in China. That's concerning to me. It's concerning that the mindset at the top levels of those corporations were not instantly opposed to collaborating with the Chinese regime in order to censor internet search terms, the results that they ended up seeing, and then in Yahoo's case, of course, providing information, privately identifiable information to about individuals who ended up, in Amnesty International's view, being prosecuted and convicted because they were prisoners of conscience. So Amnesty's, I think, report that they did a few years back on undermining freedom of expression in China, the role of Yahoo, Microsoft, and Google, I think is relevant here because these companies did not unilaterally and on their own volition decide to stop cooperating with these regimes. Now let me mention one of the arguments that they would make on this, and that is, well, if we don't do this, somebody else is going to. And I think our response to them should have been in that context, well, let them. If somebody else wants to engage in censorship, let them do it, but you shouldn't be the one who does it in any instance. It's just at the fundamental level of what American view of human rights is. We get down to freedom of religion, freedom of expression, free speech. When we have American companies who are participating in that type of conduct, it's deeply, deeply troubling. And it took the pressure of organizations like Amnesty International and others. It took congressional hearings to end up putting the pressure on these companies to the place where now it appears that they're no longer cooperating in that. So I think there's some evidence here is all I'm saying. I'm not saying that this is the same, by any means, the same level of concern. But I think it's some evidence of a mindset at the highest level that it is okay to censor based on our view of what's moral, our view of what is acceptable, and a lack of concern at the level that we would expect of those who have completely bought into the American view of freedom about the fact that they are violating human rights and freedoms. Let's see. Let me just mention one. By the way, one of the things in the congressional hearings that it was a bipartisan response to this. Representative Tom Lantos, a Democrat from California, said in congressional hearings, your abhorrent actions in China are a disgrace. And he said, I simply don't understand how your corporate leadership sleeps at night. That's the type of thing that I think should have, frankly, gotten more attention in the American media about what was happening. It got some. I don't think it got enough. I went back and did research on it recently. I think it's the type of thing that should have really been raised to the highest levels. There's difference of philosophy. Well, maybe we're bringing greater freedom to China. Again, I think the view is we don't engage in censorship with a repressive regime. It's not something that we do for profit. It's not something we do with a view to the greater good, because the greater good, in the way that we've figured out what that balance means in the United States, is that you always protect freedom of expression of basic political and religious speech, and we weren't doing that. I think the third thing that concerns me about it is that, about what's happening from some of these platforms, is that in an age of accelerating religious diversity, it sends precisely the wrong message to Americans wondering, how do we treat religious views with which we disagree? I think the message in some ways is that if you have enough power, you could perhaps get away with censoring the speech of Americans with whom you disagree. Again, this is not government speech, this is not government action, but it's still concerning that very powerful actors in American society are making decisions about what speech they agree with and what they don't agree with. As the Free Speech Charter notes, these private companies are generally not subject to the First Amendment, but the First Amendment is a statement not just of law and of Constitution, it's a statement of deep moral American principles about what it means to have freedom. And these companies, of course, to the extent that we agree with it, these companies are indeed beneficiaries of our system. They're beneficiaries of, as I think Colby pointed out, our free speech rights and our First Amendment rights as well. So in America, I think we celebrate the right of those whose religious views we deeply disagree with. That's our attitude to that. We do not force them out of the marketplace of ideas, as the John Milton Project and as the NRB has talked about. And we know that the truth has nothing to fear from an open, forthright debate. And we only those people who are afraid of freedom are those who censor and punish ideas on political or religious speech that they find offensive. I think that it plays into some of the mindset that we've seen even in recent times in the attitudes towards Muslim minorities. So for example, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee recently, there's been a lot of backlash against a mosque that wanted to expand itself. And one of the arguments was made that, well, this isn't truly a religion. Islam is not truly a religion, which of course came to a surprise, as a surprise to millions of Americans and also those overseas. And on that basis, they weren't subject to, they didn't have the full range of First Amendment protections. I mean, that's a deeply troubling view, and I think it shows that we have to be careful about when we're making distinctions between speech that we think is acceptable religious speech and speech that we think is not acceptable religious speech. Let's see. Finally, I would say that we've had a broad array of religious speech in this nation on social movements. If the internet had come of age in the 1960s or the 1950s, would we have thought it was okay for Facebook to censor the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King because he was engaging in highly controversial speech? Or how about Catholic Archbishop Joseph Rummel, who in 1963 integrated the Catholic schools in New Orleans against hostile opposition, calls for boycotts. What he was claimed was what he was doing was not for the greater good. It's not necessarily, again, that we want to have the government making this decision, but I think our job is to make sure that under what's commonly called the doctrine of corporate social responsibility, we're making sure that we're holding these corporate actors to the same standards that we would expect of the government on these issues, and that is in the social and political realm. If they're not living up to their own standards of what free speech should be, then we need to let the public know that. And we also need to show how they are being inconsistent on their views. So that's sort of the background of that. I know there's other questions that you'll have, but I think there are some concerning trends. Again, I don't think that we should get engaged in legal regulation of these organizations, but I do think that we need to be concerned about their attitude and what it portrays about the attitude of these corporations towards religious free speech.
Thank you, Brian. Before I let Colby take a minute or two to add some additional comments before I go into some specific questions that I've got, I want to throw a piece of raw meat to you, Colby. Brian, you talked about a minute ago, you talked about corporate responsibility, companies not living up to their own stated principles or policies. And you may or may not know about this case, Colby, but this is a case in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. It was a decision that came up from the federal court in Virginia dealing with a public official who was sanctioned by his agency, a public agency, for his Facebook postings, which happened to be opposed to his boss who was running for office. Now, it presents some clear, classic First Amendment issues because he was a public employee. But what's interesting is Facebook's amicus curiae, friend of the court, brief that was filed. And the statements, and I assume counsel passed this by Facebook when they said it. And let me throw this to you, Colby, for your reaction. Here's what Facebook said through their attorneys. Quote, Facebook, for itself and its users, has a vital interest in ensuring that speech on Facebook and in other online communities is afforded the same constitutional protection as speech in newspapers, television, and in the town square.
Wow. Would that they could live by that standard. I think they're got a little more zeal there than they do, feet on the ground, or the way the world really works. I haven't read the amicus, but I'm now going to go find it because I think that's quite curious indeed. The process, it seems to me, very difficult to sort of slice up. If you say to a Google, for example, we've heard that as long as you have other options and ways in which you can access the information, then maybe we shouldn't be as anxious. about the fact that there is a considerable amount of, shall we say, editorial control over what it is that may or may not be permitted based on various speech policies that Facebook or somebody else has. And maybe that's fair enough, but what do you do when Google, for example, will manipulate its algorithm such to where particular views are simply not showing up on their search results? Is that something that we should be troubled about? Or as opposed to, for example, just simply tweaking it to where it doesn't show up high, but rather the search engine optimization puts it down quite a bit lower. Well, you still have access to it, but obviously somebody's been manipulating it in a way to give it a different, result as it shows up. Clearly, editors edit. The Supreme Court's cases are just filled with the idea that publishers get the privilege and prerogative of being able to edit, and nobody up on this panel is going to suggest to you that we should be able to tell an editor how they're going to edit. But there is, it seems to me, something very different about creating either a social utility or a larger social platform, and if you're not there, then you're not participating in the debate, as it were. Being able to simply say, well, we get to make those kind of judgments, because then all you do is pick at the things like Huckabee saying, go on August 2 and buy a Chick-fil-A because you want to support the company because it supports traditional marriage. Like, traditional marriage has now become so controversial in certain circles that it creates enough of a motivation to say, oh, you can't be in this fora anymore. That, I think, probably shocks and disturbs the average person out there. Should we be willing to accept it? Well, that's why we're having this larger discussion, and that's why I think NRB is right at the heart of it. It has to be a voluntary process. It has to be something that's consciously considered by all of these fora or places or engines or ISPs or however you may describe them, and they don't all operate, they get to decide how they're going to run that algorithm to determine what sort of things come up. So it's a very difficult question to try to peel back, which is why I think, as I say again, NRB's got it right when it says it has to be voluntary, and we're suggesting that if you look at what the courts have wrestled with in the context of First Amendment, as it applies to state actors and state conduct, you're on the right track. But if you simply leave it to how you feel, or whether or not 7,000 versus 70,000 can complain about the Manhattan Statement and then pull it down, even though there's 70,000 that say, oh no, put it back up, it seems to me that you're asking for trouble and you just keep picking at the sore spots. So I think they need to develop a much more consistent, much more uniformly applied process. Otherwise, you're going to continue to have the kind of reactions and the kind of more heat than light, if you will, that sometimes comes out of these processes.
Good. Thank you, Colby. Now, we're going to have a rapid-fire Q&A period with our panel. I'd ask our panelists if you could try to make your answers as concise as possible. Unlike some of the federal courts Colby and I have been in front of, we won't give you a green light and then a red light, but I may interrupt from time to time. Let me start with you, Adam. And by the way, I went to a recent symposium that Microsoft put on here in Washington, D.C. about their family safety tools to aid parents in monitoring the content that their children are deriving from the internet and ways for families and parents in particular to control their children's access to the internet. And it's a fabulous tool, by the way, and Adam was one of the speakers. Adam, I know that you consult with a wide range of these new media giants on a regular basis. Now, I don't want you to name names, but as a general proposition, the industry of new media in general, what is motivating them? What are the primary motivations for them to shut down some speech, like the Manhattan Declaration, like some of the YouTube videos that I've talked about, and other examples that we've listed?
Well, the fundamental problem here is that one person's legitimate religious expression is another person's hate speech, right? I mean, this is the problem we face, is that we have a very serious philosophical difference in this world. People disagree about things related to sexuality, relating to lifestyle choices, relating to abortion, and so on and so forth. Not a lot of common ground in this area, and when these people find a common area to mix it up, there's going to be trouble. And they're going to ask the information intermediaries to establish policies that maybe favor them in one direction or another, or to hush speech that they don't like. Some of those information intermediaries will be more open to that than others. I think clearly some of these companies, being based in California and Silicon Valley, may be hearing a lot more from the constituencies that want to hush certain types of speech, specifically of a religious nature. And so it should not be surprising that they try to cater to that more vociferous audience. Now, I think many of us don't like that. I think I agree with NRB wholeheartedly that that should not be their policy. And I think we should pressure them to change it. That being said, it's difficult to know what that process should entail. I mean, is it a vote? I mean, do they do polling? I mean, we could probably lose a lot of those polls, right? They could say a lot of this religious speech is hateful speech and should be censored. So I hope that they take what may be an unpopular stance with their own constituency and say, no, we will encourage robust freedom of speech on all these issues. But sometimes it will be difficult line drawing exercises. And Craig, I'll just quote a line from your own framework here and ask you to defend it, because I think you're opening up a bit of a loophole for yourself. You say, on the other hand, new media platforms should establish some rules of civility and decorum regarding the manner in which content is communicated. This has to do with personal attacks.
Right.
Now you can imagine, you can easily understand how creative audiences out there can say, oh, well, this certain religious speaker just said something about my views on gay marriage. It's hateful. It's hateful. It's not civil.
No, let me defend that.
Okay.
Let me defend it this way.
Turn the tables on you.
What we're trying to do is we're trying to look realistically at a set of rules and policies that we really can defend. And I know, as an example, that there is a great deal, some sites, by the way, and you know more of them than I do, Adam, but some of these things are Wild West platforms where, now not necessarily Apple, Google, or Facebook, Tumblr is an example I've read. There's a great deal of speech that goes on there that wouldn't be allowed in other fora.
Right.
But that, I think we can differentiate, because we aren't dealing with the First Amendment, we're dealing with frontier policy here. We're breaking new ground. I think that we can differentiate between a personal attack against someone and an issue that addresses an issue. As an example, one of the toughest issues for us to deal with is anti-Semitism. None of us appreciate it or defend it. NRB has a very strong position, I think, in practice among our ministries, not countenancing anti-Semitism. But what do you do with the KKK kind of a statement, or a sympathetic statement that denigrates a certain demographic group? I think there's a difference between abhorrent speech like that, which, by the way, the Supreme Court allowed in the Phelps case recently, where outside of a funeral of an honored military man who had lost his life in defense of America, and his family was there, and we had a handful of aberrant protesters who said they were speaking from a biblical standpoint, and in no way represents any Bible that I've read, denouncing the issue of the gay agenda and picking this particular forum outside the funeral as the occasion to do it. The Supreme Court said, look, there are going to be people who have their deeply held feelings attacked and insulted by allowing a full, robust view of free speech. But that's part of the price that we pay for that kind of liberty. But let me draw a distinction. Tone, I think, can be regulated, and we could sit down and we could probably talk about the nuances of the language, but I think tone and civility can be regulated in a voluntary kind of a way where these sites say, look, we are encouraging you not to use pejoratives against people that you are responding to on a blog, as an example, but you can feel free to denigrate an entire class of people, even though we abhor it. There's a distinction between a personal attack against a specific named individual, where the person might be subjected to further harassment or even violence, and a group where more, I think, typifies an issue advocacy rather than an anti-personal attack.
That's interesting. By the way, I should mention, for those who aren't familiar with what Google did related to an anti-Semitism issue, because it does get to something Coley was suggesting, he was worried about sort of algorithmic sort of manipulation that could disfavor certain types of speech. I haven't seen any real examples, but I've seen the opposite, which was that very famously about 5 or 6 years ago, when the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, brought to the attention of Google that the #1 search term, or sort of result, algorithmic result, natural result, not manipulated, natural result, when you search by the term Jew on Google, was Jew Watch. Very clearly anti-Semitic material. Some really odious things that are said on Jew Watch. there were a lot of people, most notably the ADL, who were pretty hot about this and said, hey, this is awful. What are you going to do about it? And Google said, we're an algorithm. We're just providing a neutral platform. This is the first thing that comes up because it has a lot of readers, unfortunately. Go populate your sites with better stuff to get higher in the ranks yourself. They said, no, that's not good enough. They started putting pressure on politically. But there wasn't really much they could do for all the reasons we've already discussed here. Interestingly enough, what Google did is instead of tinkering with their algorithm, for a time they put up a notice above the search terms, or the search results for the search term Jew. And the first one that would pop up would be a link to something that Google wrote saying, are you offended by this term? Basically,
Counter speech, yeah.
yeah, counter speech, right?
Well, but you
And then it linked out to the ADL. But here's the problem with that, Craig. How do you have a counter speech opportunity like that for everybody who's possibly offended?
and then it opens the door to fairness doctrine
Exactly.
concerns, which
And
we are
right.
very opposed to. Now, there are some alternative remedies, and we don't have time in this discussion today, but there are alternatives to banning speech on these platforms. For instance, they can be red flagged, or you could provide a link. There are a number of creative options. There was a Boston Law Review article that suggested a couple of these creative alternatives short of censorship that these new media companies have available. Problem is, then in the same law review article, these law professors said, but we think that they should ban things that cause emotional distress to the reader. So again, you're opening up Pandora's box. Let me switch for a minute to Stephen Waldman. You're a journalist. As you know, and as your monumentally complex and daunting report on the future of media indicated, that everybody's converging. The old media and the new media are all converging, and everything is heading in one way or the other to web-based tools and platforms. Now, including the traditional media, newspapers, television programs, radio, and so forth. Now, what if Facebook takes a policy? What if Google and Apple take a policy where we say Democratic speech only, Republican speech only, conservative speech only, Democrat, liberal, libertarian speech only? What is that going to do to media journalism in the traditional sense that uses these kind of devices?
Well, one of the things we were concerned about, and it's sort of a premature concern, we didn't have any evidence for it, but was that in this world where we're all encouraging a lot of innovation on the local level to have new journalistic models, what if Google ended up having a stake in one particular journalistic model against another journalistic model? Or what if, this came up in the Comcast NBC merger, what if Comcast ends up slowing down news from CBS videos and promoting videos from NBC? So you do have the capacity for gatekeepers to exert pressure in different directions that favor certain types of journalism. I think in general, in thinking about how to cast this topic so it has a broad level of persuasiveness, I think journalists in general would be supportive of that kind of open approach that NRB is advocating. I would say that it would be more effective if this wasn't framed as a protection of conservative Christian values, but rather as a protection of free speech and freedom of religion in general. For instance, there was the case of that I think Verizon blocked text messages going out from the National Abortion Rights Action League. Another ISP blocked work that was being done by a labor union. So it cuts both ways, just because it happens to be targeted in the examples that you mentioned against conservative Christians. I would say conservative Christians aren't the only ones who are at risk, and that there could be a kind of a broader support for a broader coalition around something like this. And I would think that the other reason I think it could be effective is that there really is a free speech ethos on the internet. And I think when, if the argument is put forth out there that what Apple is doing violates the free speech ethos, you will find lots and lots of people who don't agree with NRB on anything else supporting this position because they are hardcore free speech advocates when it comes to the internet. And then the last thing that points to is transparency. One of the scariest things to me is we don't really know what these companies are discriminating against or not. We found certain examples because they kind of popped into the public. But we had people coming. When I was doing the report, I had people coming up to us saying, we suspect that Google is manipulating their algorithms so that MapQuest doesn't come up high on their search results because they have Google Maps and they're promoting Google Maps instead of MapQuest. No one could really prove it, so we really don't know. And so I think a kind of cousin to these principles would be a strong effort around transparency. That these companies, even if they might want to make a full-throated case that they ought to have the discretion to discriminate, maybe Apple to some degree is obviously what they care most about is avoiding controversy. They seem controversy averse. You may know about the case where they banned the political cartoonist Mark Fiore. So. Maybe another way of looking at it is they can do that, but they have to be transparent about the situations when they're making such decisions and explain why.
Brian, let me hop over to you. You made an interesting point, and because this is a frontier area of policy, as you can gauge, I think most of you listening to this, there are no rules of the road. We've picked the First Amendment because that is something that was created by an institution that is part of the constitutional fabric of this country, and from that standpoint, the executive branch nominates and the Senate confirms, and the Supreme Court sits in judgment and interprets the law. It seems to us to be a very constitutional type of a body to use their principles. Second of all, as you pointed out, Brian, the First Amendment is more than just a legal document. It's also a document of principles and values. Now let me go to this paradigm, because I think it's important we articulate the starting point. What's the first principle of how we distinguish between what new media companies should do, what they should have the discretion to do, and what they should be doing? We've talked about the difference between content providers and platforms. And one of the things that I've argued for the last couple of years in John Milton is we had to treat it like the old 1600s, where there was a printing press and then there was the guy with the quill pen who was doing the writing, and he'd hand it to the printer. The printer who pulls the lever shouldn't have free speech censorship rights over the guy with the quill pen. But sometimes those distinctions are difficult to make. As Colby pointed out, Google says that their search engine is a form of speech, and that may be. But there are clearly some platforms that are simply not. They're simply conduits. And by the way, as I read the Open Internet appeal that's currently pending right now in the D.C. Court of Appeals, the so-called net neutrality order that the FCC, very controversial, that they ordered this particular, what they consider to be a low-level form of governance for ISPs, internet service providers. Some people think it's more than simple minimal supervision. Some people think it's too much government intrusion. But in the brief that the FCC filed, they made the distinction between content providers. I use the illustration of the editor up in the editor's office because I worked for a newspaper when I was a student in college, and the printing press in the basement. Now, is that a valid distinction? Is that a helpful one for us to go forward and say, wait a minute, you're just a printing press. From a moral, social value standpoint, you shouldn't have the right to discriminate based on speech. But a website or a blog site that provides content, you're like an editor or a reporter upstairs. You should